Hi everyone, welcome back to the course on Sociology of Media and Communication. Today will be the 5th lecture of Unit 1 and today we are going to talk about something which is very interesting, which is the medium is the message. This is a very popularly used quote from the work of Marshall McLuhan, published in 1964, titled Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. Now, this is a pioneering book which one studies in media studies and communication studies because it primarily talks about understanding media. So, McLuhan actually suggests that media is an extension of humans, which means that it primarily enables us to feel and primarily also get in touch with something as an extension. So, for him the role of media is extension. So, I am going to talk and explain to you why did he say that the medium is the message, but before that let me actually talk about an example that he uses to illustrate the role of the media. So, this example is that of the electric light bulb, which he says that if one looks at it as a form of media, is a very simple one, because it does not have any content per se like print media or television media, but yet it has a specific role, and that role is actually to illuminate the room. In that context, if one sees, the medium is actually the message, because the electric bulb and the introduction of the electric bulb changes the way that we think about society. So, primarily he proposed that media themselves and not the content that they carry should be the focus of our study in studies of media, because it is this form that is playing a role in how we understand and think about societies. So, the characteristic of the medium itself affects the society in which it plays a role and not the content which is delivered. All media have characteristics that engage the viewers in different ways. Now, mind you that this position of Marshall McLuhan has also been critiqued widely, where others have not necessarily agreed with him that the medium is the message. Now, he also talks about different media and then how these different media invites different degrees of participation. This he primarily understands through the hot medium and the cool medium. So, the hot medium, one example that he uses is that of movies, whereas the television is a cool medium. We will talk more about it as we progress through this lecture. Now, when we think about McLuhan's hot and cool categories, they actually do not exist in vacuum, they exist on a continuum, which means that when we are looking at the medium or media as extension of ourselves, we have to look at if our senses have been extended in an artificial form, which means that when we are thinking about our impact on our senses, they could be relative to societies and also to social groups within societies, which is why these hot and cool categories, they do not exist separately or in isolation, but in a continuum. While one looks at hot and cool medium, and McLuhan was not familiar with digital forms of media, one can also see that the development of these new forms of media have radically transformed humanities' outlook and system of thought. For instance, the implosion of time and space in this new world because of facilitating instant communication by digital technology actually sort of changes the way that we understand how media used to be. So, a lot of critique of McLuhan's medium is the message could also be drawn from the fact that digital media and the content that it has actually changes the way that we think about media. So, digital media in one way has also dissolved the individual consciousness of how typed words and printed words basically lead to shared universal consciousness, and this is also possible not just in the imagined community through print capitalism, but also the digital media. What the digital media also does is extends our central nervous system into one shared system, and this is where we see how media has an impact, particularly forms of digital media, on our very senses. So, when we are using social media, we not only read, we watch, we listen, and there is a clear continuous engagement with media. So, going back to McLuhan's "the medium is the message," he suggests that the content of any medium is always another medium. So, essentially what this means is that when we are thinking primarily the message of a medium or technology, it is also the change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into human affairs. The medium is the message means that the medium shapes and controls the scale and form of human association and action. So, when television became a reality in the world, the understanding was that the medium, which is the television in this context, is changing how the world perceives the reality of what is being communicated. Now, according to McLuhan, the content plays a secondary role, and it is the medium which is the primary significant factor. In many cases, the content of a medium is another medium. For instance, when we are writing, the content of writing is speech, because we are also thinking, and when one is printing, the content of printing is writing. So, one can see that when we are thinking about the medium, it is actually in the McLuhan sense the message. The two categories that he talks about, hot and cold media, need more clarity, and let us go through them. So, hot media actually has high definition, and what high definition in this sense means is that it is rich in data and it has one dominant sense. It primarily requires less audience participation, but impacts us more. For instance, the radio, the movies, the photographs, these are seen as forms of hot media. On the other hand, cool media is low definition, which requires less data, more complete engagement. For instance, the telephone, the television, the cartoons, the graphic novels, etc., where you need more audience participation, primarily because you have to decode, you have to understand more. This classification of his into hot and cold again are not universal and may have cultural contextual sensibilities. They also depend on literacy levels and sensory habits. So, when we are thinking about different societies, hot and media could be very different. For example, he takes the example of the radio, which is a hot medium in literate societies, because it could be used for entertainment purposes, you listen to songs, etc. In non-literate societies, it could actually have a very intense disruptive impact, and in many cool cultures where the society is contextually defined in a different way, hot media could feel overwhelming. So, when we are thinking about introduction of these digital forms of media, while McLuhan does not talk about them, you and I, when we deal with these digital media, we know that they have specific purposes in terms of social groups and societies. So, it depends on the audience in terms of how media is introduced. Digital media has specific purpose for youths, for elders, for people who know how to operate in the digital world versus who do not know how to do that. So, there is an understanding of how media itself and the nature of it in terms of cold and hot varies according to the cultural context. Now, when we are thinking about the print media, it is a hot media, it is also an impersonal medium which requires little participation, because the printed word is given to you and you read it, and he is talking about the newspaper. The telephone is a cool medium because it encourages interaction. Choosing print over the telephone, it reduces dialogue and participation. So, if one compares the print and the telephone as medium, there is an obvious way in which one can see that the print is a hot medium, whereas the telephone is a cool medium. Now, this also reflects a Western literary bias where print media was valued because of the impersonal nature, whereas the telephone was more engaging and interactive. Now, interestingly, also remember that these are very different kinds of media. One is, as you know, the name suggests, part of the print written word, whereas the telephone would be a part of more communicative form of media. Now, media as extensions of our senses, they create new ratios among our senses and also among media themselves when they interact. So, a lot has been written now about digital media and the impact it has on our senses, on our minds, etc., as well as on other forms of media like television. For instance, what happens on social media, let us say on X, becomes a part of news content that is also broadcasted on the television. When the radio came, it changed the form of the news story, and the TV also caused drastic changes in new radio programming, and then how the documentary novels were written. So, if one looks at books today, for instance, after the entry of how books have been converted into films and television serials, there is also a particular group of book authors, writers who will be writing with the specific agenda that they get converted into television serials or movies. Similarly to OTT series now, because we have OTT platforms. So, what does it mean? It means that when there is an extension of our senses through one media, there are also changes in other forms of media. The meeting of two media creates new forms of media, and it is also a moment of different kind of truth and revelation. So, you see that there is primarily freedom from the usual numbness which is imposed by media on our senses, because now there is an interaction between forms of media. The interaction between these social media and digital platforms like X and Instagram and Facebook, and then television news is a very good example to understand how, when a new media is introduced, it extends our sense, and then there is an intersection between the two. The role of media is also about translating one kind of knowledge into another. So, he suggests that Lyman Bryson talks about it through technology is explicitness, which means that the mechanization process translates nature and human activity into amplified and specialized forms. In a way, media acts as a translator of knowledge, where they function as metaphors that translate human experiences into new forms. What this means is that in many cases, for instance, there could be YouTube shorts or videos explaining complicated concepts which otherwise may not be also possible for people to understand. These lectures which NPTEL organizes is also a great way to understand how knowledge is democratized and made accessible through the use of the media and technology. Language, when we are thinking about especially the spoken word, was one of the first technologies that allowed humans to understand each other. Now, words in that sense could also be seen as one of the first senses of technological explicitness. In the electronic and subsequently in the digital age, humans are being increasingly translated into information, where we are moving towards an extension of consciousness through technology. In the discussion on artificial intelligence and how intelligence itself has been molded into an artificial form, one can see how our senses have been extended further beyond what had happened in the electric age. A little bit more about the spoken word, because it is very immediate, it is implicit, it is dynamic. And what the spoken word or speech allows is that you are able to react in time, live, through gesture and your actions. Writing in comparison is a much slower process, it is more sequential and also more fixed and limits immediate response. So, when we think about the impact that the spoken word has, it actually could be more, because writing would encourage specialization and also restrict emotional involvement and attachment. It creates distance. Literate societies develop the ability to act with detachment, unlike non-literate societies that remain more conventionally emotionally engaged. And this is the reason why, because the mode of communication that is being used in the literate societies is oral, it is verbal, there is more attachment in that sense. Now, electronic technology and electrical technology suggest a shift beyond the written and the spoken language, because now communication could also mean not just verbal expression, but even the visuals of it, the observances of it. The written word, apart from the spoken word, also has primarily depended on how we think about societies as less accessible, and this is one point that has been talked a lot about, that how reading and writing are actually fairly recent human skills and behaviors that have been learned. They have not really been part of human society, unlike communication. So, when we think about the written word, primarily the written word has been seen as a marker of exclusivity, because it has enabled the rise of educated, civilized quote unquote individuals, where the ability to write, the ability to read are seen as very significant markers of cultural capital, taste, a privilege as well as prestige. Now, the written word is also in that sense primarily connected to how the societies that we have in terms of reading societies and reading cultures ranked hierarchically superior. So, it is a form of media which conveys a message in the McLuhan sense that your medium and the way that you have written words, printed words, etc., is the message of superiority. Then he goes on to talk about a very interesting kind of media which you can see as road and paper routes. Now, he likes to talk about different kinds of medium and not just the conventional ones that we would think of as medium. So, every medium not only carries, but also transforms the sender, the receiver and the message. This is something which happens when we do media studies, that we think about how the medium changes the sender, the receiver, as well as what happens in the process of the messaging. The use of any kind of medium or extension alters the patterns of interdependence among people, primarily because we are moving from human communication to mediatized communication, and all technologies act as extensions which increase power and speed. We have seen this even with the shift from handloom to machine production, where there is an increase in efficiency. There is also a difference in the speed of information as we move towards more efficiency in how information is communicated. Older structures were not designed for high speeds, which led to a sense of loss as people struggled to adapt to faster forms of movement. So, electronic technologies bypass space and time and transform human interaction. They create new challenges for organizational and human involvement. Interestingly, it also means that again here we are thinking about the transportation, mobility, roads, paper, infrastructure which is physical to be a part of how we communicate. So, it is not simply only about being in one place and verbally communicating with each other, but it is also about using these technological infrastructural facilities. The roadways, for instance, has contributed a lot to communication and technology. Similarly, railways. Then when we think about the clock as a piece of technology, it actually produces uniform time. So, the time is separate from how human beings experience rhythm differentially. Here time is measured not by the uniqueness of private experience, but by abstract uniform units. Now, the modern clock actually presented a uniform idea of time in most societies, as now time began to be understood in one uniform sense. So, what is happening is that the medium in this case, the clock, is actually delivering the message that adhere to the social conventional idea of time. A little bit about print media. Now, when we are thinking about print media, electric technology introduces non-visual ways of storing and retrieving information which transform culture and science. For instance, print. A lot has been already discussed about the importance of print media, particularly when we were thinking about and discussing about the public sphere. And print media is a pictorial statement that can be repeated precisely and indefinitely. So, primarily it has actually been at the core of several groundbreaking changes in human history. We will talk more about the print media in the next lecture and understand the nuances in how it changes this history of media and communication. The printed word and printing were the first mechanizations of a complex craft, which is writing, and actually becomes the model for later forms of mechanization. It creates the modern world by shifting many previously existing boundaries and patterns of culture, primarily leading to the rise of nationalism, industrialism, mass markets, and also questions of universal literacy and education. So, when we think about print media, the idea that all of us would be reading the same newspaper, the same books, it created a sense of a community, a belongingness, and that is how these ideas of social were also created. So, when we think about media, the photograph today also occupies a very significant position, where it acts as a tool that isolates and freezes moments in time, where gesture, visual expressions, these are also emphasized, but they are freezed, unlike in television where there is no freezing. Now, in the photograph, McLuhan suggests that one can see that it encourages collective experience, primarily because of how, let us say, photographs in a family album would be viewed by everyone. There is a collective experience to being captured and watched. The photograph plays a key role in the development of films and visual cultures, where when we say that the camera cannot lie, actually also hides many ways in which photographs can be used to mislead. Interestingly, the photograph as well has been a big part of how we understand media and communication, and we will talk more about it in unit 2 when we do the semiotic approach to understanding the images. Nonetheless, the photograph remains a very important part of how media is also a part of understanding the visuals. The press is connected primarily to both the print and the photograph, as both the printed word and photographs are a big part of the press, where you see a lot of fostering of collective participation, social ideas or participation, watching the same photograph together, etc. One medium which you may not be familiar with today, but used to be a big part of media some time ago, is the telegraph. And the telegraph actually creates an integral whole of private and public awareness through speed, where your private distress and information could be carried through speed to a public form of communication. The electric form ends the mechanical age of individual steps and specialist functions, and electricity offers a means of getting in touch with every facet of being at once, like how the brain itself does. In one way, the telegraph is also an extension of one's senses, primarily because it enables one to be in touch with their distant world. For instance, you may have migrated from your home to do a job outside, but the telegraph keeps you connected, very similar to what WhatsApp or SMS would do today. So, the telegraph is something which was also a symbol of how electronic technology enabled more communication, more access. We will also discuss a little bit about the telephone, which was a very important invention in modern history, and a lot has been said about the telephone, where you see that it extends your sensory, your speech, modular senses, and basically leads to extra sensory perceptions. The telephone provides a primarily auditory way of understanding each other. It introduces a seamless web of connecting with each other, and it is very personal, it is intrusive, but at the same time it can ignore bodily gestures, etc. What McLuhan is trying to also do in this book is trace a journey of how these forms of media over time have historically developed and then impact human senses. Movies. Now again, movies like photography communicate without language or syntax, primarily through the visuals, and it is a spectacular coming together of the old mechanical technology and the new electric world, as McLuhan would suggest. And what movies also require is that an audience. Now films not only reflect the rise of consumer culture, but in a way becomes a commodity itself. In many cases, films are also not seen as a single medium like a song or a written word, but actually a collective art form, because different individuals are bringing in different roles when they are making a film. The radio, it deeply engages users, allowing them to create a private world even in crowded environments. Think about the audio sets or the headphones that you can use to block sound out and create your own world. The radio used to be something like that, and the headphone today is again an extension of one's senses, where one creates a private world out of a public sense of loss of imagination of how the individual is. Now McLuhan's ideas of media primarily suggest these transitions that he shows through these different forms of media. So, in the end, we would talk a little bit about television, which would also be the foundation for the lecture on television as a form of media, which will follow the lecture on print media. Now, television as a medium rejects what would be the print medium's reliance only on words, and the television introduces as a cool medium a very high degree of audience participation, because the audience is constantly decoding what is being communicated, and the arrival of TV in that arena and area as well as era affected most other media forms, including movies, national magazines, etc., primarily because it also showed an intersection between the television and other forms of media like films. For instance, film celebrities, film actors would not only be appearing in films, but also doing television interviews. Now, primarily what the television does is that it created this world where there were a lot of debates and discussions on the nature of the television itself. Many of you will also have heard that it used to be called the idiot box, with this assumption that idiots watch the television, and in contrast, if you were reading, the reading activity and skill is seen as something which intelligent people do. McLuhan argues that effects come from the medium and not the content. Therefore, the attempts to control media through censorship are misguided and based on print-based thinking that separates form from content. So, his understanding of censorship was that it was completely directed through this understanding of censorship in print media, where it made sense, because if you stop what is being written, it had an implication, but in this context of, let us say, the television or other forms of more interactive forms of media, he argues that it is the medium which is the message. Now, like I said previously as well, there have been also several critiques of McLuhan where his argument has not been accepted by many, who also suggest that the content is important, as can be seen when we also live in a world of communicative abundance with a lot of misinformation, lot of fake news, etc. However, his works provide an understanding of how we should think about this relationship between media, our bodies, and then the social world. Thank you.